I was given early access to Grey Zone Warfare to play the game for a whole week ahead of potentially what will be its future early access release. Now, we don't have any indication on when that will be, and it very much appears that from the developer standpoint, it's when the game's ready to be in a good position versus when they will just ship it for the sake of shipping it. I wanted to sink plenty of time into Grey Zone Warfare before I gave you guys my impressions. And now that I've done that, I'd like to give you guys my thoughts, because I think with a little bit of polish, Grey Zone Warfare not only could be one of the best first-person shooters to release hopefully in 2024, but also the go-to extraction shooter, dethroning Tarkov and pretty much dethroning anything else that tries to work in this category. I'm going to start this video with all of the things that Grey Zone Warfare is doing well, and then talk about some of the problems later on in the video. But it's worth remembering that this is a alpha slash pre-alpha build, and this is far before anything that anybody is going to play. It's also really good that developers are being super transparent about things. We've had a list of things that have been broken and that they're looking to fix. We've had a list of fixes that they've managed to ship even within a day of this being played, and there's just a really great transparent system going on here. The devs are being vocal, they've been in a Discord call to help us identify bugs and quash things as they appear, and honestly, I have a lot of confidence in the guys behind this game because of that. They haven't set any unreasonable pressure or expectations on themselves by providing a date, and are simply working towards what they will feel to be a product ready for early access or ready for release. But you'll be pleasantly surprised at how well polished this alpha slash pre-alpha state is for Grey Zone Warfare. The first thing that jumped out at me right away is the persistent server system. Your server that you load into to accept quests and make it to and from your base to complete various story quests is a server that is always there. It is a persistent server with multiple teams and factions online, multiple enemy players, and AI spawning in. And this solves so many problems of the extraction shooter loop. You don't need to leave the game physically in order to organize your loot or get a new quest or start new things. You could still be in the in-game world at the main base to accept new things. It keeps the immersion factor there, it doesn't pull you out of the experience, and I really, really like this. And it also means that if your character happens to die, you can run the risk of doing effectively a risky run to try and recover your equipment. If you die twice, you lose the first body that you initially lost, meaning all of your gear would despawn. So effectively, you kind of have this DayZ style risk system where you can try and potentially go back to your own loot, provided you don't die to enemy combatants who are likely to loot it. This is a far better system than what a lot of extraction shooters are using right now, and it allows you to stay in the game itself, interacting with other faction members, interacting with the quest lines and your teammates in order to get things done, without pulling you out of the experience for you to then have to go back in. For each faction there are 150 quests, but a certain percentage of this are the same between the three factions. Each faction effectively also has their own starter town, which allows them to understand the basics of the game and get some initial quests done. Progressively, those quests get more dangerous, and they send you to deeper locations within the actual map itself, which is 42 square kilometers, which is absolutely huge. And this will greatly increase your chances of running into higher tier AI bosses, and also enemy players in similar areas. The great thing about this is that they've also solved another problem with conventional extraction shooters by effectively creating a tiered progression system and a tiered combat system. While you can head anywhere on this 42 square kilometer map at any given point in time, because the quests progressively send you further out and progressively send you further into radiation zones into the center of the map, you effectively get a system whereby players who are of high gear and are working at a high tier loot level are only combating other players in high tier loot levels. The worst thing about games like Escape from Tarkov is spawning into a map and suddenly the guy to the right of you is entirely fully geared with some of the best things you've ever seen and instantly deletes you. So by having a persistent server system and an open world, they've even managed to solve that problem by effectively creating a tiered progression to the difficulty of enemies, the difficulty of your missions, and how far into the map you actually have to travel. This is a really intelligent system, and I think once people get hands-on with it, they'll realize just how smart it is, because it means that you'll progressively be able to work your way through the map and through the storyline. And whilst you do have the freedom to go into any area and search for any loot whenever you want, it does also mean that there is going to be a sort of structure to things as opposed to things just being pure chaos. Some of the missions are fairly straightforward, but others are a little bit more complex, and the game actually doesn't necessarily reveal all of the details that you need in order to get things done. They'll give you approximate locations and things to look out for, and also hints like medical buildings or compounds in order to give you an idea of what you should be looking for, but they don't lay it out in 4K in front of you. And I much prefer that. I would much rather a system that requires a little bit of work and a little bit of thinking, increasing the risk of combat itself, versus just being handed every single bit of detail on a plate. There's also various bits of world lore and secrets about the map that we've only really scratched the surface of, but occasionally you can run into some very heavily armored and heavily geared enemy combatants that have their own setups in their own locations. The next major advancement and thing that I love about this game is something that I think is a perfect middle ground between lots of other titles. Grey Zone Warfare feels like the perfect combination of DayZ, Escape from Tarkov, and something like Call of Duty's DMZ. Now, don't take that as a bad thing. By no means is this a casual, easy to play experience. This is a brutal extraction shooter, and you can lose your gear, and you can die, and you will run into PvP, and you will run into some AI who are capable of instantly mag dumping you. What I actually mean by this is that whilst things aren't easy, things are intuitive. This game has lots of complexity to it. It has a full-blown ballistic system, an armor system, a ballistic system that has bullet penetration values. It has a full-blown health system, so if you get shot in different parts of your bodies, different penalties are applied. If you lose blood, different penalties are applied. But the whole system doesn't feel taxing. It doesn't feel like it's taking you out of the gameplay experience, and it doesn't feel like it's ruining your game. In something like DayZ, if you get shot in the arm, it's effectively a GG, or if you lose too much blood, it's effectively a GG. In Grey Zone Warfare, there is an easy to understand health system that allows you to recover yourself in game without necessarily having to pull yourself out of the experience. And it creates this really good risk reward variant. Because it's all well and good having bandages, suture kits, medical supplies, tablets, whatever you so happen to need, and even things like food and water, which you can manage on the fly. But if you end up taking up too much combat and taking too many hits and burning through these resources, there is no guarantee you're going to find more in the field. Things like suture kits, which are necessary to patch up your internal organs and reduce penalties to your general weaponry, is something that you won't necessarily always find, and you'd have to scour medical cabinets, hospitals, and doctors' areas in order to get them back. Which means you have to make a business decision between whether or not you're happy with how far you've progressed, or if you're going to have to call it a day, call in a landing zone helicopter to take you back to base, and just deal with what you've got on paper. The health system, the bullet system, the ballistic system, the inventory system is all extremely advanced and extremely complex, but it's also very simple and very intuitive. It's something that doesn't feel like it takes you out of the game, it doesn't feel taxing, it doesn't feel like it's boring, it all just works. And I think this is something I've not really seen in any hardcore shooter, or something that very few of them actually get right, but this feels somewhat a bit like Armor Reforger. I feel like they've really got this in a really good spot. And finally, the visuals. We will touch on performance, but the visuals in this game are utterly phenomenal. This is one of the most immersive experiences I think I've ever played for a first-person shooter. It is graphically absolutely stunning, it looks phenomenal, and it just feels great. Now, there are some things that could deal with some improvement. We will talk about that, things like animations, things like performance, and some audio to some extent. But the game is just stunning. There's no way around it. Unreal Engine 5 and all the extra tech that this company is using to make this happen is knocking this out the park. And also, I did mess around with things like foliage levels and shadow levels to see if I could cheese the settings in such a way that made things more competitive or less competitive, and the answer to that was a stern no. So if you're using dark spaces, foliage, or shadows in order to support your combat experience, hide from enemies, or do whatever it is you'll happen to do at that point of time, that is something that won't change from graphic system to graphic system. So you won't have people doing things like they do in DayZ, where they end up deleting the grass or playing on the lowest shadows to get the best advantages. It just seems to work, and visually it's absolutely breathtaking. So all in all, there's just a lot to this game to love. I think they've taken the extraction shooter formula, they've added a ton of really good polish to it with persistent systems, a quest line, an open world, and a progression system that feels like it makes sense. I also just really love the depth in all of the things like the health system, the ballistic system, weapon systems, and the fact that these don't feel taxing. They feel like a very natural part of the game that is very easy and very accessible, but doesn't take you out of the fact that you're in a hardcore experience that could be very brutal at times. You will run into some AI who are incredibly capable, or you'll run into other players who are incredibly capable, and certainly once we started playing against some of the harder AI outside of the starter town, you really felt the need to work together in a team experience. We tried sweeping and clearing a hotel segment, which is a little bit deeper into the map, And some of the AI there were capable of absolutely rinsing you if you weren't careful. And collaborating with either your faction members or the squad mates that you go in with is honestly a surefire success way to make your way out of this game safely. And even then, we had multiple people die, we had multiple people get knocked out, and we had to bring them back to life. And it just felt like the systems were working. But not everything is perfect, and we will talk about that. This is definitely an early state. It's something the developers aren't shying away from. They've been very honest about the fact that there are things that aren't working as they'd want them to, things that are crashing at the moment that they didn't want them to, and things that just aren't working out right now. One of the lead developers tweeted that in 21 hours they had 11 render crashes, 6 UI crashes, 3 VoIP crashes, 2 engine crashes, 2 animation crashes, 24 client crashes, and 15 server crashes, and that most of them were fixed within a 24-hour period in today's update. So whilst we content creators do have early access, we also are effectively early test bunnies, and these guys have done a phenomenal job, and they're being super transparent about where things are. We live in a world in terms of game development and in terms of publishing where people try to hide all the problems and all the secrets and sell you a product that ultimately doesn't work. So having a development team who have said, yep, these are all the things that have gone wrong and here's all the things we fixed in this certain period of window is really phenomenal. I personally had a crashing issue with the game when it first released and I couldn't actually stream it, and that issue was related to the hardware that I was utilizing. Whilst there technically wasn't anything wrong with the hardware, how it interacts with UE5 games was in fact a problem, and a well-known problem actually in the tech space for those of you on the latest Intel generation of chips. But it's something that they even sat in a Discord and tried to help me out with, and it's something that they've actually alleviated in this patch. So this is an early build and things are unstable, but there are a couple of other things that definitely need work. The animations are a little in the rough side of things at the moment. They're close to feeling fluid in places, less so in others. Third-person walking animations and sprinting animations, as well as some of the first-person animations for how you hold your weapon, how you vault things, how you reload, have a little bit of jank to them, and some of them don't look as clean as they could. I'm sure the devs are very much aware of this. I'm sure it's something they are working on. This is a very early build. But you also want these animations to be readable. You want player animations and AI animations to have different behaviors so you can easily identify what is what. And also, it's really handy that the AI on the map often have callouts and voice lines that make them more identifiable versus actual player combatants. But player combatants who are using the voice system in the game are also audible, so you could accidentally stumble into an enemy conversation. Overall, animations felt like they were in like a C plus or a B minus. There are some of them that are phenomenal. The way the helicopter interacts with terrain, the way the reload system works, the disassembly and reassembly, the bandaging. But there were others that just feel a bit janky. And generally, it's the third person animations, seeing other people sprinting, other people reloading, other people bandaging, that can sometimes look a little bit funky. But it's something that I think can be worked on. The next big thing I have to touch on is performance. Now, this is very early stage, but it is UE5, and generally speaking, the technology they're using for vegetation and the landscape itself is its own tech. And the game is incredibly taxing. With a 13900K and a 4090, even using things like DLSS or FSR, I'm still ending up only in the sort of low hundreds in terms of FPS, which is perfectly playable. But most people don't have top of the line systems, most people won't have this kind of horsepower, and generally speaking, this is going to be a taxing game. Now, without a doubt, they can optimize this thing and they can get things locked in to improve performance. I'm confident of that, and UE5 generally has a lot of tricks and tools up their sleeve in order to make things like that happen. There's also things in an early build that generally are unoptimized. You'd be surprised how simple as something as a texture can accidentally sap performance if not dealt with correctly. So it's definitely early on, and it's too early to judge how performance is, but I would say this is a very CPU intensive game because of things like the ballistic system and the physics system. It feels like it's on this sort of armor spectrum of things, but I would expect this to improve by launch. Right now, at the moment, this is a game for people who have new to new high-end rigs, you know, your 30 series GPUs and above, your new CPU series and above. And that's not something that really runs in the PC community. The reality is very few people actually have top of the line systems, so we want to see more progression on that front. Now, the general FPS space for extraction shooters is also fairly rough for that. People who play Tarkov will know that the performance for that game can be absolutely dire, and people who play other games like Arma, Squad, and other tactical shooters and milsims are very much used to the fact that performance on games with these taxing systems can be a little on the lower end. But I would still expect to see a fairly good improvement for this before this game releases, and it's something I'd like to see the developers prioritize. I've touched on the bugs before, but seeing those ironed out before at least early access is really important. Naturally, they won't be able to catch all of them because some just appear out of nowhere, but it was really nice to see things like if your game crashed and it was a full EXE crash, you did just get transported back to the main base with all of your gear. So it seems that there are some protection systems in place to stop you having trouble whilst the game's in early access that don't necessarily mess up the gameplay flow. The next big thing for me is audio. The audio at the moment in the game is not bad, but it could be substantially better. Now, I am holding this game to a very high regard because some of the other tech it has, like ballistics and visuals, that I think are phenomenal, and there's no reason that the audio couldn't be in that place as well. The directional and positional audio is certainly not terrible, but it's not phenomenal either. Games like Squad and games like PUBG, in my view, have some of the best 3D audio systems in the game. They have some of the best positional audio for you to identify the distance of people shooting. And in Grey Zone Warfare, you do hear people shooting and you do identify the difference between something like an M4 and an AK, but you don't necessarily know the distance. You don't necessarily know if they are in the next town over, if they're a few hundred meters away, if they're a few kilometers away. And I think that's something that needs to be worked on sooner rather than later. I feel like audio is probably their weakest system so far. It's not bad enough to an extent that it's going to pull you out the experience. It does have competitiveness to it. You will hear footsteps, you will hear people creeping and healing and reloading. So that's definitely not a concern. But I think it could generally be more immersive and be a little bit higher quality. And finally, and arguably the biggest Achilles heel to this game, is going to be the artificial intelligence. Now, there are some instances of things not working in the build that we're playing, and we're fully aware of that. But the AI seem to have a bit of a weird scale to them. Some of them somehow end up tanking multiple bullets before they go down, even though they're not obviously armored. And armored enemies can sometimes tank a huge amount of ammunition before they go down. This is something that's been raised with the developers, and it's something that we are actually talking about with the devs. But I think when you go into the starter town, it's expected that the AI aren't going to be too overpowering. Now, when you're deeper into the map, some of the AI we encountered were highly lethal, capable of using cover, and working in a coordinated manner to actually deal with you as a threat. In the starter town, it was a bit more of a sort of random spray and pray, and sometimes it was actually fairly lethal, and other times it wasn't. Now, naturally speaking, you don't want the AI to be too terrible, and you don't want them to be ridiculously overpowered and delete you from across the map. You can use things like foliage and other pieces of cover to conceal yourself from the artificial intelligence, which is a really solid method of doing things, and things like suppressors will also count towards audio occlusion. But I would say generally, at the moment, they feel a little stiff in places. I would like to see the animations be a little bit more dynamic. I would like to see them take cover a little bit more often. And I would like to see them treat it like they're in a combat environment. I think in some scenarios, you get some AI who do feel like that, especially in the higher tier areas. But even with the low tier AI, I still have expectations of things like them running to cover when they're being shot at and making the gunfights a little bit more prolonged. At the moment, sometimes they just sort of stand in the open. Sometimes you'll shoot at one of them and they'll take a while to react. And arguably the most frustrating thing is firing multiple bullets into an enemy who very clearly doesn't have armor, but seemingly lives. I think if an enemy AI has more visually identifiable armor, it should survive a fair number of hits, but the inverse should also be true. Again, it's alpha, things are going to change, things are going to improve, and the AI did have redeeming qualities that didn't make them completely terrible in some of the deeper zones, but I'd like to see more universal behavior in terms of how they perform and how they work. Overall, I'm just incredibly excited for Grey Zone Warfare. I think for a build that's this early, the amount of polish, the amount of detail, and the amount of care that's gone into crafting what I feel will be a better or next generation extraction experience is truly next level. I don't think you would see a game like this from AAA publishers with infinite amounts of funding. I think you can only get something like this from a dev team who are being very unique, very candid, very transparent, and trying to push the boundaries further than ever before. I really do feel as though, with the right amount of polish before this releases to the wider general public, Grey Zone Warfare could be the go-to extraction shooter and one of the best FPS games on the market, full stop. There's a long way to go for that though, and there are some things that I'd like them to work on, but when you have a development team who are being open, honest, and transparent, it's something that I feel should be celebrated in the space, because it's something that's becoming more and more rare and something that we're seeing less of. They also haven't given themselves fixed dates to get things out and release them. They're taking their time with this one and letting it cook as necessary, which I really appreciate given some of the rushed releases we've seen. So folks, if you want to see more exclusive early access to Grey Zone Warfare, drop a like, drop a subscribe, and you'll see me in the next one.